Hello, welcome to another episode of Being Spiritual at RU with Scott and Matt, and we have a guest today with Rabbi Josh. Thanks for coming by, Josh. Good to have you
No, it's a
today.
pleasure. Great to be here.
You want to introduce yourself just quickly?
Sure. My name is Rabbi Josh Lopel. I am the Reformed Community Educator at Rutgers Hillel. I have been a rabbi for 18 years, and I love interfaith work and I love sharing stories. So it's such a pleasure to be here.
Great. So part of our work is as the Interfaith Alliance at Rutgers, working with the Dean of Faith and Spiritual Initiatives. I always forget what her title is. And then also one of the deans for student affairs that we work with. And we get together with them and figure out programming and things. We're having a program tonight, as it happens to be, which we're hoping. I don't know that they'll see this before the program, probably not, but you could definitely ask us more. But you'll get to hear a story. We did a story 2 weeks ago from Chaplain Kaiser Aslam from the Center for Islamic Life, and we wanted to get. And so one of our meetings, which was around that time, or maybe almost a month ago, we shared just randomly, spontaneously, started sharing sort of sacred
Mm.
stories from our traditions, and Kaiser shared one, and then Rabbi Josh shared one, which I think specifically was
Yes.
midrash. And I'd like you to maybe, whether before the story or after the story, tell us some more about the tradition of midrash and how it affects, how it plays into your work with students, and yeah, just educate us.
Excellent. No, I appreciate the invitation. A midrash is a Jewish interpretive tradition where we have the five books of Moses, the Torah, and we also have, the Hebrew scriptures, the larger compendium of Jewish knowledge, what in the, Christian community they call the Old Testament. For us, it's just Testament, and so we don't use that term. We use Hebrew scriptures, or Tanakh
Right,
is the Hebrew. And it is a
right.
wonderful, I think part of Jewish tradition that we get to interpret these sacred texts, and we get to sort of see what we can learn from these fantastic stories from our tradition. And so the rabbis will look at the text, and literally it could just be a word, it could be a phrase, and then they'll say, well, wait a minute, what does this really mean? Now we can sort of read the text
Mm.
as is and say, okay, well, this is the story of Abraham, this is the story of Moses. But then they say, well, wait a minute, like what's some of the background? What's like sort of the hidden parts that are not like in the Torah, that are not in the Bible? And the rabbis are using their imagination, their creativity to sometimes teach a
Mhm.
lesson, right? Almost like an Aesop fable, for example, sort of like a morality play. Or sometimes, frankly, let's be having fun, with the text. Let's have fun with the tradition, and sort of just almost like a tongue-in-cheek, kind of story. So, an example,
Mhm.
if I may give an example, Moses, right, is very famously slow of speech, right? It says, like in Exodus, when he's talking to God about going down to Egypt and about confronting Pharaoh, one of the reasons he gives that he shouldn't do it is that he's a man that's slow of speech. What does that mean, to be slow of speech, right? And so the rabbis look at this text and they go, like, well, what does that mean that he's slow of speech? So then they create a midrash. They create a story that explains
Hmm.
why he is slow of speech. And the story they give fills in some of the gaps in Moses' life that the Bible doesn't go into. Where it'll say, okay, well, Moses was drawn out of the water, and that's what Moshe means. He was drawn out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter. And then it sort of fast forward to him being a young adult, and we don't get a sense of those like years in between. So they say that one day baby Moses was sitting on Pharaoh's lap, being sort of raised in the palace, right?
Mm.
And one day, as babies do, he reaches up and he grabs. And what does he grab? He grabs Pharaoh's crown and puts it on his head. And then all the magicians go, oh no, this is terrible. This means that Moses, he's going to overthrow you. He's going to be a thorn in your side. We have to kill this kid immediately. And so Pharaoh, at this point, being a little bit reasonable, says, I don't know. Maybe like we should have a bigger test to see what Moses' deal is, you know. And so they put the baby on a table and they put in one, bucket, they put jewels, emeralds, rubies, all this wonderful, sparkly stuff. And in the other bowl, they put hot coals there. And the idea being is that if he reaches for the jewels, that means he's going after money and wealth and power, and he's going to overthrow Pharaoh. And if he grabs the coals, babies just grab stuff once in a while. It doesn't mean anything. They put baby Moses in front of these two things, and you think about, a baby. What's the baby going to grab? The sparkly stuff, right? He's going to grab what's shiny and bright. So baby Moses' hand goes in that direction. And then the Midrash says an angel grabs his hand and pushes it into the coals, or he burns his hand. Now, what do you do when you get a burn on your hand? If you're little, you put your hand in your mouth. And so he sears his tongue. And then for then on has a lisp. He has a speech impediment. And so that is why he is slow of speech, because he has this mouth
Mm.
injury, from the time where he was a baby. That's not in the Torah, like at all. That's just a story the rabbis made to explain that phrase, why he is slow of speech. So that's like an example midrash.
So it doesn't have sort of authority. It's
It doesn't
just
have authority. It's
commentary.
commentary, but
Right.
very specifically, it's like storytelling. Quite literally, it's like storytelling.
Mhm. Yeah,
Using your
using your imagination.
imagination.
I love that.
And sometimes, again, like they're there to teach, a lesson, to impart something or to emphasize something. And sometimes it's just an explainer. It's why something has
Mhm.
happened. There's a very famous, with Cain and Abel. Like it's one of the first stories in the Bible, and it has been noted, of course, that it says in that story, and then Cain said to Abel, and then nothing, and then Cain is in the field, and they were in the field together, and there's just a gap there. It doesn't say what Cain said, to Abel, and so the rabbis say, okay, well, maybe Cain said to Abel, let's go into the field, because the next thing is, and they're in the field, right? Something quick, simple, doesn't need a lot of explanation. And others say, well, no, like that piece that's missing, right, is about the fight they
Mm.
had, like that led to Cain killing Abel. That what we're missing there is the actual reason for the fight, or how it was all set up. So they
Right.
need a tale to make that make sense together. And again, it lets them use their imagination. And sometimes they're, again, fantastical, like kind of stories that aren't meant to be taken literally. And some are like really famous and they get to the point where, like, I know that certainly in my community, we almost think they are like in the Torah. Like they become so famous that we think it's actually there. Like the story of Abraham smashing the
Right.
idols. Like is a story. That
Mm.
Abraham is called, by God, Lech Lecha, go out from your land to land that I will show you. But then they say, how does Abraham know there's one God? How does Abraham become the first person to understand, experience God like in this way? And they give you a story from Abraham's youth that Abraham's father works as an idol seller. That he makes and sells idols. And one day Abraham takes a hammer when his father's not around and smashes all of them except for the biggest one. And he puts the hammer, in the biggest idol's hand. The father comes home and says, "What happened here? Like, why was all my merchandise destroyed?" And Abraham said, "Look, I gave an offering to one of the idols, but then this big idol got really upset and smashed all the other idols." And his father's like, "What are you talking about? Are you crazy? How is that possible?" And Abraham says, "Well, if you don't believe it can do that and that it can smash other idols, how can you pray to it? How can you, believe this is valuable and
Mm.
important, right?" And so Abraham's trying to get one
Mm.
up, on his dad in the story. And it shows from a young
Yeah.
age Abraham's devotion, right, and his understanding at a higher level of what God is and what God isn't. And so I'll be teaching, the
That's
Bible to my students. And they're like, "Where's this story about Abraham and the idols?" No, it's like it's not in there. It's just a story that we created to
I
illuminate, the story of young Abraham.
right. Well, I'm assuming there are collections of
Yes,
midrash you can
yeah, there are
read. Right. Okay.
collections, and so like there's a set of midrashim. It's a plural for midrash, midrashim, that are based on each book like of the Torah. So you'll have one about Genesis and Exodus, where it sort of goes almost verse by verse to talk about different
Mm-hmm.
stories, and others, that are just like different sections of the Torah or of the Bible, for example, because we'll get like books that are a midrash on Esther or a midrash on Lamentations, sort of some of the later books. Not
Mm-hmm.
all of them have like midrashim, but a lot of them do, and it's really, again, they're really fascinating texts because it gives like an insight on what the rabbis were thinking about, what was important to them, what was interesting to them. Um, you know, I'm someone who loves some good wordplay, some good puns. I'm a words with friends guy. I'm someone who loves the New York Times word games, and the rabbis love that too because they'll find a word, and they'll say like, "Well, this word actually means this," or if you change this letter over here, it means that. And they just like use this wordplay to sort of create stories as well to connect the words together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the midrash. I think like for the intersecting stories for us is Jesus would have known about the midrash,
Yeah,
and he very much taught like kind of a rabbi from the midrash, like telling stories, making connections, like you're saying. And I think we forget that sometimes as Christians because we take sometimes scripture so literally when Jesus is telling a story to make a specific point, like rabbi, like a rabbi would. And I think even as I read the scriptures, remembering that too, that like the author is writing this story to tell a particular point. Like there's a point to this at the end, and so sometimes we get caught up. Like, did God flood the whole earth?
yeah,
And those things. It's like, well, that wasn't kind of the point of the story. The point of the story was God saves His people. God is gracious to His people. And
uh-huh.
so I think
Right.
as you were talking, my mind was just going there as a preacher, as someone who teaches in the Christian faith. There's a lot of similarities, and I enjoy the midrash. There's a website, I forget the name of it, that I use, and I like when I study Old Testament or the scriptures. I like to go to the midrash to see what the rabbis have said.
Definitely, because there's a lot of like interesting, you know, stories. Something again about like sort of context, what they were thinking about, what was curious to them, and it just adds like another layer, to the scripture,
Mhm.
another way of sort of reading it. And I like innovation. Like, I like creativity. And I think they give us sort of a pathway, the rabbis who wrote these midrashim, to say, look, like it's for us to interpret, the text. It's for us to sort of be curious and ask questions, and like that there's more than one way to derive meaning, I guess, from the text. That there's like the literal like understanding, which is
Yeah.
great, and there's also a midrashic level, a drash level, we call it, where we're interpreting the text sort of differently and seeing also like how it relates to our lives today, which is something that all of our faiths,
Mhm.
sort of talk about. We get the scripture, we get the textual reading, and then we get up there, on a Shabbat, on a Sunday, on a Friday, whatever our day of worship might be, and then we try to relate, these stories, these tales, these instances to life today. And Midrash gives us a nice sort of root to that. And I'd like to think that we all, in our own way, are creating Midrash, in the work that we do. Because we're interpreting, text.
Mm.
We're up there saying, "Oh, this is what this text
Mhm.
might mean. This is how it relates," and that's what they were doing back then too. So I'd like to think they're all part of that same interpretive tradition, and the idea of like
Mhm.
modern midrash, because spoiler alert, a lot of the folks who wrote these midrashim, thousands of years ago, 1,500 years ago, whatever it might have been, depending on when it came out, a lot of dudes, writing this stuff. A lot of men who are writing these texts, and then you get to look at it now through maybe a feminist perspective, through an LGBTQ perspective,
Mhm.
like how are we looking at this text and interpreting it differently, than perhaps it was maybe intended back then. But we're all coming with new eyes, like to the text. Every year we get
Mhm.
to look at it in the Jewish tradition. We read a cycle. Like every week is a new Torah portion. We begin, with Genesis 1:1, and every week we sort of read until we get to the end of Deuteronomy, then we start all over it again. And every year, the text is the same, but we're different every year. What we're bringing to the text
Mhm,
is different
mhm,
every year because we are hopefully changing and evolving, each year.
mhm. Yeah, I was going to mention, I have a friend who's a biblical scholar, mostly, I think, of the Tanakh, but she has published now 2 volumes of
Hmm.
womanist midrash. And basically, I have gotten into them a little bit. She also has some really interesting commentaries on different scriptures and things. So yeah, it's really interesting. She's a woman of color and bringing her perspective as a Christian scholar studying Hebrew scriptures. What
It's literally on my bookshelf. I can
how
turn the
is
camera. It's like right there on
oh
my
is
shelf. Yeah.
okay,
Uh,
excellent, excellent. But so at our meeting, you shared a story about the crossing of the
yes,
Red Sea.
Nachshon.
If you'd like to tell that one.
Yes, it's one of my favorite midrashim. It also falls into the category of a midrash that is meant to teach us a lesson. So as I mentioned, some of them seem to be like almost creative and fun for the sake of sort of finding some backstory perhaps, or just trying to emphasize a point. And the story of Nachshon, I think, falls into the category of really trying to teach us something about what it means, to be a leader, what it means to sort of live, in an intentional way. And so the story of Nachshon takes place in the Midrashim. It's in the middle of Exodus, of the Exodus story, where the Israelites have escaped Egypt. Pharaoh has let them go after the 10th plague, and the Israelites are moving towards freedom. And then Pharaoh very famously changes his mind. Pharaoh was a little fickle, changes his mind, sends the troops, the army, after the Israelites to bring them back to Egypt. And so the Israelites are walking, they're schlepping all the way through the wilderness, and they come to the Red Sea. And now they have a problem because the Red Sea is in front of them and the Egyptian army is behind them. And they're sort of stuck in the middle. And this is not a great scenario for the Israelites. There is a problem because now they're trapped, right? And so the tradition teaches us that they're all panicking, they're not sure what to do. And the Midrash says there's one person, his name was Nachshon ben Aminadav. Nachshon is a leader in the tribe of Judah, and he decides that he's not going to stand there and wait for the Egyptians to get them. He's not going to wait for anything to happen. He's going to just walk and walk forward and hoping and praying for a miracle, a redemption moment. So he starts walking into the sea, and he's up to his ankles in the water. He's up to his knees in the water. Keeps walking up to his hips, up to his chest, up to his nose. When it sort of reaches that point where he can no longer breathe, the sea then famously splits. And then the rest of the Israelites follow Nachshon, through the dry path that the sea has now split. And they cross the sea, and then, of course, the sea closes in over Pharaoh's armies. And the story is amazing because when we read the biblical text, the center of the story is Moses. Moses lifts up his staff,
Right.
right? And that's when the sea splits. We don't get any of the story of Nachshon. And so what they're doing is they're creating a midrash, a story about Nachshon having faith, right? Having a hope that things are going to change, but only if he acts, that only if he himself makes an effort to
Mm,
create what he wants to see. So Nakshon walks like through the
mm,
water, through the path, despite there being a challenge there, with faith that things are going to be all right. That somehow things are going to work out like for the best. But he's not waiting for the miracle. He helps to create the miracle. So it's really a beautiful story that we
yeah.
use to talk about how we have a role in our own redemption. We have a role in making the world a better place. That we can't just sit around twiddling our thumbs, waiting for the miracle to happen. We have to do something active ourselves. It's actually funny, by the way, because connected midrash uh, talks about Moses, like standing on the cleft of the rock, that sort of image that we all have.
Hmm.
And he's praying, he's
Right.
praying to God, he's praying to God. And God says, Moses, there's time for a long prayer and there's time for a short prayer. This is the time for a short prayer. lift up your staff and let's go. You know, and that's when he lifts up his staff. And the sea splits. Words matter,
Mhm.
but actions, again, speak louder than words, and we have to take that active role. Please, let's get going, Moses. Let's go. And so Nachshon again is that epitome of like that midrashic story where Nachshon's mentioned in the Torah a few times, but he's not a central like figure. We don't get a lot of his backstory. We don't get any of this, but he is now sort of chosen to be this leader figure because his name is mentioned. Why is he mentioned? He must be important. Well, then here's a story to show
Mm.
why he's important and why moving forward that
Mhm.
Judah, the tribe that he is represents, becomes the center of Jewish life. The kingdom of Judah, Judaism, right? And so Judah becomes the
Mhm.
land of Judah. Later on in history, right? And so Judah becomes like the seat of the monarchy
Mhm.
at that point. That's where Judah is. So it's really it all tries to tie together to show that idea of faith and leadership, and really trying to literally walk, in God's ways and God's path, and to create the change we want to see in the world.
So that I don't know how the different traditions and the different
Yeah,
denominations in
yeah,
Judaism, how they would react to Midrash. But I know, speaking as someone who grew up with very fundamentalist Christians, they would see those two stories as being contradictory.
yeah,
And so only one could be true.
yeah.
Would Jewish rabbis or whoever now, would they necessarily see them as contradictory or
It's the joy of the
complementary?
midrash is that for us, even in the Orthodox tradition, like the midrash isn't authoritative. We have other
Mm, mhm,
systems of law, that are more like are more about laws and legal. These are more again more like fables. So they can be contradictory
mm,
because there's so
mhm,
many of them. And so when it's like,
mhm,
well, this is what this means, and this is what this means. And then the rabbi says, oh, maybe not. This is what this means, and it just sort of keeps going. That's a joy of Jewish
right.
tradition is that we love to argue and we love to debate and we love to like have different perspectives, on the text. It don't necessarily have to jibe, with each other, which is a lot of fun. Because
Right.
then again, it leads to that creativity and the innovation and saying, this is one way of looking at it. Oh, but here's another way of looking at it. And here's another story
Mhm,
that can be fun and add on to the discourse, that we're having. But yeah,
mhm,
they're not meant to be,
mhm.
taken literally the midrashim. So that helps in terms of being able to have contradictory
Right.
ones.
I love that. I mean, I'm just thinking about Christian arguments,
Mm,
and we don't like it
mm,
when two Bible stories are contradictory, like Scott was saying.
right.
And I know that I think there's at least two creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2, maybe
Yeah.
3.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
when you dive deeper, there's
mhm,
multiple authors and multiple, origins from where they come from. And that really messes with Christians' minds that there can be contradictory stories. But I think that's helpful. Like you've kind of given a good overview of like how rabbis taught, how they think that there's multiple ways to look at the same story in the scriptures and different opinions, and that's okay. I think through our scriptures, even the New Testament, we see Paul, especially the Apostle Paul, interacting with different stories, different ideas, and I think that's healthy because, like you said, there creativity comes out of it. I think deeper learning, deeper spirituality can come out of dialogue,
mhm,
and so we shouldn't be afraid of it. So
mhm.
I appreciate that word. That's a good word.
Mm, that sounds good. Sounds right to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for jumping on.
This was
Oh, a
great.
pleasure. So happy to be
Helped very.
invited.
It's always. Yeah, no, I just love learning and talking and revisiting ideas that I may think I understood, but when somebody else, like you said, we're different people, and when I hear you describe midrash versus another rabbi or another person, then I say, I see it a little differently.
A
So,
little differently. It's always great to have different, perspectives, and when we learn from each other, and we just get a greater understanding of our traditions, our values, and the more we share with each other, I think it brings us closer together. So I really appreciate both of you for having me on and for having this experience
Yeah.
with me. I really enjoyed it. Really appreciate it.
Forward to tonight, and we're looking forward to tonight for this meeting. And I don't think it'll be recorded, otherwise else I tell people to watch the recording. But if you hopefully I sent out a lot of flyers and things. Hopefully we're going to get a good turnout. So
All right. Well,
So
thanks.
it's gonna be fun.
We'll see you guys soon.
See you soon. Thanks again, everybody.
okay,
Have a great day.
bye bye. Take care.
Bye.